So it seems to me it's more of a question of how much violence a male is, a boy in particular, is exposed to, not whether they are exposed to violence. And
Right.
some of the violence I don't even think really gets recognized. It's so ordinary, it's so commonplace, just happened, but wow, there's actually a lot underneath it. And there's been several cycles of that in my adulthood, of this, of realizing, oh, I still have more, I have deeper healing to do. Just simply to do your healing work, whatever it is. I think it's so important for men to engage with healing work. I think it's one of the most important things that can happen in the world right now.
I can remember when I was 15, my parents had moved us, my father could to closer to work because my father was just tired of driving as much as he had to do. And going into high school, I was starting to get picked on by a few of the guys. It's that time to test out the new guy in school to see how tough he is. While I held my own, it totally controlled my high school experience, and not for the better. Whether you're in the victim or the perpetrator of violence, it's likely that experience still affects you every day. Haunted by trauma or past may even be impacting your current relationships as victims become the perpetrator, continue to cycle off suffering for generations to come. Today, we're going to dive into male-to-male violence and what it can do and what we can do to heal our past trauma. But in the meantime, before we get into all that, if you're interested in raising your standards as a father, a husband, an entrepreneur, then I encourage you to participate in our Band of Brothers group mentorship program. We're a group of ordinary guys working towards living extraordinary lives. And you can find us at the Awakened Man Training Academy at members.theawakenedman.net. With that, let's get on with today's episode.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
Welcome everyone to the Revolutionary Man podcast. And my name is Alan DeMonso, and I'm the founder of the Awakened Man movement. And before we get into our topic today, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. Do you get into fights in your youth? And was it because you were the bully or you were being bullied? There's a feeling that when you get after being in a fight, the emotions range from fear to excitement, pain and relief. And depending on the severity of the violence, it can leave an emotional scar that shapes how you interact in relationships and the world. And my guest today is going to share his story as he talk about his latest book on how he's changing men's lives. So allow me to introduce my guest. Brad Mewhort is on a mission to prevent male-on-male violence and end physical bullying. He's the author of The Peaceful Man: Heal Within Yourself, the Personal Effects and Historic Patterns of Male-on-Male Violence. This book was inspired by a childhood of being bullied and being a bully, leaving him with unhealed wounds. But since 2014, he's been teaching and supporting other men on healing their journeys by facilitating group and individual coaching sessions, receiving extensive training in coaching, somatic practices, group facilitation, and transformational change. And he wrote this Peaceful Man in service of his vision and as a means of helping men embark on a journey of their healing. Welcome to the show, Brad. How are things, my brother?
Pretty good, Alan. Thank you.
It's really great to have you on the show today, because I think this is a topic I have yet to really touch on on the Revolutionary Man podcast. And I think it's so important for men to get to understand this aspect of what many of us have encountered. But before we really get into that, and I shed a little bit of light on your story, we always talk about all of us being on a hero's quest. And I have to say your story is incredible. So the first question might need to be expanded on a little bit. But anyways, can you tell us in particular about a time in your life when you were challenged, maybe even felt lost, and knew things had to change for you? What did you do, and how did that experience shape you into the man you are today and the work that you're doing?
I think the most important experience for me in answer to that question is when I was 13, and there's actually something parallel in this story to what you were describing there. When you were 15, I was 13, had moved to a new school. Would describe myself as a physically small man today, but I was very small for my size, for my age at that point in my life even. And I had to wait a half hour after school every day for the school bus. And I was started being bullied more and more severely, in particular by a group of 4 boys, all of whom were much larger than me. And, at first I didn't even tell my parents about it. I was kind of ashamed of it. It wasn't really that bad, I tried to tell myself, but then it just got worse and worse. And eventually I told my parents about it. My parents went to the school administration, who kind of said, well, boys will be boys. What can we do about it? My dad told me, I think the only way you're going to resolve this situation is to fight back. He said, you're going to have to the smallest of the 4, who are all much larger, when they, come around you, grab that one and just make it into a one-on-one fight with him. And he says, that's the only way you're going to end the bullying. And at first I was just like, that's crazy. I can't do that. They're all bigger than me. They'll kill me.
Yeah.
But then one day I had an incident where, of these 4 boys, 2 of them grabbed each of my legs and basically had a tug of war with me. And I experienced this terror like I'd never known before. I didn't know if I was going to actually ever be able to walk again. I didn't know if I was going to walk away intact. And that was an extreme enough terror that I felt that I was like, okay, I'm, even if it's crazy to fight back, I have to do it. I don't know what else to do. So I told my dad, okay, I'm ready to do this. And he made a punching bag and he taught me to fight, which basically meant, grab him and keep punching him, with not anything too elegant about it.
Yeah.
So I practiced that with him a little bit. And then I said, okay, the next day at school, I'm going to fight back. And sure enough, the 4 boys circle around me and I grabbed one of them and I just started punching him and kept punching him. And just as my dad said, it did turn into a one-on-one fight. And and my dad said, it doesn't matter if you win or lose the fight. If you fight back, you're no longer an easy target. But much to my astonishment, I actually did win the fight quite handily. And I certainly couldn't say that was the end of all bullying or that I never had issues again, but it never again was nearly that severe. So there was a lot of positive that came out of that that I can look back on. I learned to really do something that I thought was, virtually impossible, that terrified me, and to do it anyway. And that would probably be the biggest positive lesson, to do something that I'm terrified of and to just do it anyway.
No,
because
absolutely.
It's important to me because it matters.
Yeah, 100%. And listening to you tell your story, it just takes me back to the challenges that I faced at 15, and similar to your story with a group of 3 or 4, and it ultimately would be it's always interesting that it seems to happen in groups, right? And while I felt I could hold my own and had held my own on a one-on-one situation, it got to the point where it really prevented me from going out and doing things. I grew up in small town Saskatchewan here in Canada, and so it was always the bush parties and and going out, right, and having fun with friends. But I just couldn't take that chance to go in, put myself in a place like that, and to hear hear that story. I think back of how that has shaped my life, and to your point, right, the positive out of that experience. And while people may think, well, boys shouldn't fight, the dynamic and the issue that we get into in these situations don't always leave us with any other choice. And right, especially when you're dealing with it in a bully situation. So what do you think is what do you think has been that has perpetrated that? And why do we have so much male on male violence in society today?
Well, I think it goes back through, if right back into history, going into the Middle Ages and probably long before that. I look at violence, all of this violence, as being patterns of violence and cycles of violence, and that there's really no isolated act of violence. And I would strongly suspect that these boys that were bullying me had been victims of violence themselves at the hands of other boys, brothers, fathers, uncles, who knows who. But most likely, in a certain sense, we could say that their bullying of me was simply trauma passing through them from whoever they received it from to me, and going back probably generations. And it's that's probably not true 100% of the time, but I think it's true a very high percentage of the time. And that is also why I think it's so important to reduce male on male violence, that this is such an important issue that really doesn't get acknowledged even as being a big issue very often, because there, as I said, there's no isolated act of violence. Any act of violence is very possibly going to have downstream acts of violence as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the other thing I was picking up from your story is that, there may be some myths out there about, the types of backgrounds that these individuals and boys are coming from. And I would suspect that it doesn't necessarily mean, although maybe the statistics would say that maybe there's a higher propensity of boys for male on male violence if they're in a broken home. But I would suspect that in your situation, much like mine, that the family structure was probably fairly normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so have you found that in your work today, that does family structure have a play in the male on male violence?
So certainly it does seem that, broken family structures, less prosperous neighborhoods, etc., tend to lead to more severe violence, I would say, but I'm not even sure about more violence. I mean, as you were alluding to, I grew up very in a middle class neighborhood. My parents were both high school teachers. But after this incident, I mean, I really became, violence became, from my perspective, the only means for myself to be safe. In a sense, violence, the capacity for violence became important to me. So that was really, I was involved with, at least by the standards of what someone might expect, given my demographics, I was actually involved with a lot of violence over the next about a decade from that point. So it seems to me it's more of a question of how much violence a boy in particular, is exposed to, not whether they are exposed to violence. And
Right.
some of the violence I don't even think really gets recognized. It's so ordinary, it's so commonplace. I actually gave a book to a close friend of mine who's a psychotherapist, and he said, "Oh yeah, but I've actually never experienced violence growing up." And I was like, "Well, wow, that's fantastic, good for you." And then he reads my book, and and through it I have questions like, "Oh, like, what have you experienced?" And after he reads it, he's like, "Oh, well, there was this incident and this incident, and oh yeah, there was this time someone walked up to me and just punched me in the face for no reason." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, yeah, you did not grow up." But he didn't even given his training as a very good psychotherapist, I would say he is. He actually didn't. It wasn't on the surface for him that he had experienced violence. And I think, so many of us carry a lot of trauma and don't even recognize that we do, because it's so ordinary, it's so commonplace.
Yeah, what a great point, Brad, about that, because it is so true that that's exactly what happens with us, right? That it becomes normalized. And if you're in a family dynamic where there's more than, there's there's siblings in there and there's more than one or two brothers, you're probably involved in some form of violence.
Yeah.
You know, I can remember the rough housing around the house, and and at times it would get pretty darn rough. Well, that's still violence, and it's how we get indoctrinated. And then I think about, my kids are in their late 20s now, crawling into their 30s, and I think about how at the time how video games started to evolve and really come on the scene big time, and how it was just normal for there to be that first person shooter games was just the huge rage, and how that was just normalizing what violence is. And so that was the one thing I took from you. The other one is interesting. I made a note here about how this act of violence that you had that was perpetrated on you and you needed to stand up really started to shape who you were suggesting in the next few years. And how is this a point in time in your life then that you went from being bullied to now being a bully?
So somewhat, I would say I was never a severe bully. And yet there were a few instances I look back on and I'm like, yeah, I definitely used force to, in a sense, make a point to keep myself safe, to just feel strong. As I got into, but even more than that, it was more like I got into fights. It was like, I decided I'm not going to tolerate anything. So it's like someone pushes me and I turn around and not just push them back, but punch them. I got into kind of cycles of violence like that. Leading me to get into, after a couple years after that, I got very into martial arts. So in a sense, it seemed to me that I had to keep increasing my capacity for violence just to be safe.
But actually turned into in a way, it actually turned into a coping mechanism for you. And from what I'm understanding, right? That does that, doing that, and then moving into a martial arts was probably, and I'll hallucinate here. I'm wondering if that wasn't the start of also your healing journey, because in the martial art traditions, you would also learn the idea of control and compassion in that piece. And so how did that start to shape and change your work?
I would say that in some ways it was. In fact, in some ways, I would say even the aspect of increasing my capacity for violence, and I didn't look at it this way at the time, but looking back, it's very clear to me. I was looking for peace. I was looking for safety. I didn't want to be involved with violence even at the time. It just seemed like the only way to achieve that was to have great capacity for violence, such that I could at worst protect myself, and at best just wouldn't even need to use that.
Yeah.
And it was, when I got into my 20s, I was, especially as I got further into my 20s, there was a lot less of, involvement with violence, etc. And I kind of drifted away from martial arts, and it kind of seemed like, okay, all of that is behind me. And at some point I realized, like, you know what? No, it's like, in a sense, it's behind me. And yet I'm still being affected by it. I'm actually carrying an anxiety, let's say, as a result of what had happened to me in my teenage years. And, and there's actually been a couple of instances in my adulthood where I've, let's say, had brushes with violence, where I've, been attacked to steal something from me when I was traveling. And there's been several times like that. And what I found is those have really brought to the surface for me all of this trauma that I was still carrying that I didn't know about. Like, all of a sudden I was right back there as a 13-year-old being threatened. And in a sense, it was like, okay, I'm affected by what just happened, but wow, there's actually a lot underneath it. And there's been several cycles of that in my adulthood, of this of realizing, oh, I still have more, I have deeper healing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a piece that as a typically as a wound heals on in our body, right? It still takes time for that to fully be healed. And even to this day, I worked in professional kitchens for most of my career, and I still have wounds, quite distinct wounds on my fingers and that from accidents that have occurred. And so that while those are, very minuscule traumas to the kinds we're talking about today, the point is that there's still a scar being left behind.
Yeah.
And the work to do now is to be able to continue to heal that. And so I'd like to move into that and start to talk about how can men heal from violence that they've experienced, and what is some of those ideas that you talk to men about.
So generally, the place to start is to just become aware of the encounters with violence, the experiences that you've had with violence, and to talk with someone about them. And I think that's an essential first step, just to, in a sense, bring what has happened to us that may have a lot of shame and fear around it, and bring it out of the shadows into the light of day, to share it with someone, to bring it into a we space rather than holding it inside of yourself. And I think there's other sides to it. Even certainly there can be a lot of shame with being a victim of violence.
Yeah.
But there can also be a lot of shame with being a perpetrator of violence. As I mentioned, there was some instances where I was a bit of a bully myself, and I have felt a lot of shame about those instances as well. So I think from all sides of it, there can be shame and trauma. And so the first step, becoming aware of them, sharing about it. That said, I also believe that this kind of talking about it, relating about it, that only goes so far in a healing process. And you mentioned a moment ago, body, what these traumas on with, wounds to your hands. And it is so, I think, so important to work through the body to get to deeper levels of healing. Violence happens when we're victims of violence. The violence happens on our bodies. And when we perpetrate violence, we do it with our bodies. Violence is a body-based experience. So I think that is where kind of the deepest healing really has to happen. And there's so many different ways to approach that somatic or body-based healing.
Yeah.
But really feeling sensations, noticing the patterns, the holdings, and just being able to start letting go of releasing those. That, I think, that's the process of really finding deeper levels of peace.
Yeah, I completely agree, and especially and I'm glad you brought up the somatic aspect of it, because we hold all of this trauma in our bodies, and when we're willing to actually dive into it, we can really do some really deep healing, because the trauma, I find, has, at least in my experience for me, has affected and pulled in other aspects of my life. So because of what I dealt with, there were a number of years where authority figures were a challenge for me, because it would take me back to that, because I felt that those were instances of that because of how the trauma had occurred, was that if I stood up or for myself too much, then I was going to get punished by some imaginary group, right? That the group was going to come after me. And I think it's really key, as you're talking about us being able to really dive into that. And so what happens if you're the type of guy that just doesn't want to do that work? Why it would be important for them to really start this healing? Because what is really are they leaving themselves up for in this world?
So you're asking, what's the importance, in a sense, what is the importance of doing this healing work?
Yeah, exactly. If they choose not to do this work, obviously they're going to continue to have trauma, but the importance behind it and why it is so important for them to really do that work.
Yeah. So I would answer that on two different levels. And one is the personal level. I think that trauma that we carry can be this underlying basis of anxiety, distrust, fear, even depression. And if we're carrying these, and even on low levels, I think that can make it difficult to really thrive in our lives, to really be able to fully show up in our relationships, to really fully show up in our passions and our work, etc. So that's the first piece. Just on a personal level, I think it's so important to do our healing work in order to really be able to fully thrive and show up in our lives.
Yeah.
And on the second level is how it affects other people. Now, certainly not all people who are victims of violence or involved with violence go on to continue perpetrating violence. And that said, I do believe that the vast majority of people who are perpetrating violence have been victims of violence. So by doing the healing work in yourself, there's the opportunity to heal violence, not just for yourself, but for the people you come into contact with. And that could be in small ways. It could be in large ways. It could be, if you haven't done your healing work, you're going to be more likely to lose your temper with someone. Could be your child, your partner, who knows who.
Yeah.
And spreading more violence. And even if it's not in large ways, it could be in small ways, even acting in ways that are threatening. Even if you don't actually get physical with someone, it could be a spreading of a small amount of violence. And doing that healing work in ourselves, I think that's so important to reduce the whole pattern of violence in the world.
I completely agree with that. I think it's so how I just like how you touched on the different aspects, and I wanted to get into that next as well, about when the violence happens for us men, how that affects us in all of our relationships, whether that's our intimate ones, our family, through work. It ends up by showing up because when we feel stress, our coping mechanisms start to come out.
Right.
And if we haven't done the work that, that especially as it's obvious that you've done, it can be really challenging. So let's come to today and think about what's going on in the Ukraine and how there's such large scale violence going on over there. How does a man who's healing from that experience, how does he relate to seeing this type of imagery all the time?
Well, for myself, it's quite horrific to even hear and to just in a sense be imagining, because certainly the violence going on there is on scales far beyond anything that I've ever come close to. So just knowing what I have experienced and just imagining the how exponentially more there is going on there, I find it quite horrific.
Yeah.
Now, that said, actually, I'm going to take one step back. As I was writing my book, The Peaceful Man, I was about halfway through it when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I did have a moment like, what am I doing writing a book about violence when, compared to what's going on there, I've hardly experienced violence compared to this scale. And I actually sat with that for a couple of days and then decided, you know what? No, with what's going on there, it's more important than ever for me to be writing this book. And I believe that while there's a huge difference in terms of scale and severity, I also believe there's a great deal in common between bullying on the playground and Russia invading Ukraine. in some sense, and I've tried to research this and find evidence of this. I haven't found anything, but I still suspect it, that in some sense, Putin is carrying trauma and has experienced violence himself. And in some sense, with all of the power, with the full power of the Russian military behind him, he is blowing out his trauma onto the entire country of Ukraine. And I would say that if he wasn't carrying so much trauma, if he hadn't experienced his own body being violated and disrespected, he wouldn't have learned to do that to others. Certainly as humans, and perhaps especially as men, we certainly have the capacity to be violent. And sometimes in the world we live in today, it's even necessary. And that said, I also believe that people learn to perpetrate violence by having their own boundaries violated, by having their bodies violated, their boundaries disrespected. And those people, having experienced that themselves, it becomes so much, in a sense, easier to disrespect the boundaries and bodies of others, whether men, women, children, animals, forests, the ecosystem, etc. I actually think we can go pretty far. And this is why I see it as being so important for us as men to do our healing work, to not keep participating in this, in perpetuating violence across generations and through cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important that we recognize that there's those cycles and those patterns that we, as you talked about earlier on today, about that when we can get into that awareness piece, then we can start to break that cycle and we can be that individual that creates the change for us.
Right.
So I want to talk a little bit now. You wrote the book, The Peaceful Man. Tell us a little bit about the book, the structure of it. What can folks that pick it up get? What will they find in it, and how you came to really writing getting this concept and writing the book?
So the book's broken into 3 parts. In the first part, which is about the first half of the book, I share many of the stories of my own involvement with violence, and I share them in the spirit of inviting other men to become aware of their own stories and to share their own stories, to, as I mentioned earlier, to bring these stories from the shadows into the light, and just to simply to have a conversation, to bring a conversation about our stories of violence. And at the end of each of the anecdotes that I share, I asked a series of questions to invite the reader to think about their own experiences that might be similar or parallel. And then in the second part of the book, I share some somatic practices, different of different types. Different ones might work for different people, so give a variety of starting points. And then the third book has another healing aspect that I haven't mentioned yet, of some contemplative practices. Nice. So these are, we could say, meditative practices around forgiveness for ourselves, forgiveness for others, and compassion for ourselves and compassion for others.
Love that. Continue on.
And sorry, I lost what I was saying.
It's all good, my friend. It's all good. I apologize for stepping in there. It's the book sounds fantastic, and I'm like that. And what I really appreciate what you're doing with that book is that you're taking not only us through that journey of the experience, but you're giving us. It sounds like you're providing us an opportunity with some tools and some different ways that we can start to begin to heal that process. And so that was really what I wanted to ask you, Ness, was how can a man work on healing from violence within himself, and what can he do with that?
Well, certainly my book is one good place to start. I would also say that for for anyone who's experienced any significant amount of violence, I would certainly recommend working with a psychotherapist. I think that's a great place to start in terms of finding someone to work with if you're not sure where to start. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think getting into somatic practices and things like that become necessary at some point to keep going deeper. But working with a psychotherapist and just being able to talk about these stories, I think, is so healing for everyone, and is a really great first step if you're not sure where to go or what to do as a first step.
Yeah.
There's also other, as I also offer men's groups where there's opportunities to share with other men and hear other men's stories and to get support in that way. So there's a lot of different ways, different opportunities. And different things work for different people. I don't ever like to say, this is how to heal. In fact, I actually think that that's quite a toxic message, that this is the way, this is the one path. There's really many ways, and different things work well for different people. And it's not even that one thing works well for each person, and different things will work well at different times. It's just really, it's an evolving process. It's a matter of really engaging with the work more than this is the one right thing to do.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. Because different things resonate with us at different times in our lives, as well as with different people. And so I really appreciate you, making that point. And so, of everything that we spoke about today, and maybe there was something that we left out, if there was one takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember, what would that be?
Just simply to do your healing work, whatever it is. I think it's so important for men to engage with healing work. I think it's one of the most important things that can happen in the world right now to heal, to evolve. I really believe that our world needs men to do their healing work and to have more men who have really done that deep healing work. We need those deeply healed men to be our fathers and our leaders and our politicians and our executives, etc., and our family members. It was just the world of the world, life, humanity. We need men to do this work.
Yeah, completely.
And I think it's the doing healing work is the most courageous work that a man can do right now.
Aho, brother, absolutely. It's the work for us to do. We have so much healing to do, whether it's coming from a deep place of trauma or any kind of trauma. We have to look forward and do that work. I just want to say thank you so much, Brad, for spending time with me today and being on the show. You know what? No matter what our history, we can heal from violence and live more fully as men. So if men were interested in getting a hold of you, what would be the best way that they can reach out?
Easiest way to find me is through my website, peacefulmanbook.com, all one word, peacefulmanbook.com. And you can sign up for my mailing list there, find out about men's groups, work with me individually, all available there on my website.
Right on. I'm going to make sure all that information is going to be in the show notes so people can get a chance to get out and reach out to you and, join one of your groups. So thank you so much again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is The Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.